Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
Hello, I'm Dan McCready, and this is Sunday Journal. We are being joined today by Chip Bishop. Over the course of his career, he has been a DJ, lobbyist, and writer. His most recent book, The Lion and the Journalist, The Unlikely Friendship of Theodore Roosevelt and Joseph Bucklin Bishop, explores the relationship between the 26th president and the journalist over many years. Mr. Bishop, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
I think a lot of people know who Teddy Roosevelt is, but who was Joseph Bucklin Bishop?
Joseph Bucklin Bishop was a great-grand uncle of mine who lived in the latter part of the 19th century. He was foremost a well-known, well-respected, and influential journalist in New York City. He was a writer of editorials as opposed to being a reporter, which meant that he was paid to express opinions, and that he did significantly with respect to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Bishop has some Massachusetts ties, as you might expect. He was born in Seekonk, and he graduated from Brown University in 1870 before he embarked on his journalistic career and married a young woman from Providence, Rhode Island in a ceremony in Seekonk. So he has some pretty good Massachusetts roots.
Indeed he does, and always a good thing to have. How did these two men come to know each other and eventually become friends?
It really happened around 1895 in New York City when Theodore Roosevelt, long before he became president, was on the board of police commissioners in New York City. He was a crusading commissioner who was determined to clean up the corruption in New York City. In those days, if you wanted to be a police officer, you paid a bribe to somebody in Tammany Hall and you got your badge and your nightstick. And when you went out on the beat, more than likely you were going to be sleeping in an alleyway somewhere or in a bar or in a brothel, not protecting the citizens of New York. Well, Theodore Roosevelt thought that was wrong. He was a highly principled guy, and he said, look, if we're going to pay public servants out of the public treasury, they should be A, qualified, and B, do their job. So he set out on this great crusade to clean up the police department in New York City. And Joseph Bucklin Bishop, my Uncle Joe, was sitting in his perch in the editorial offices of the New York Evening Post at the time and began writing very supportive and very controversial editorials in support of what Roosevelt was doing. Bucking the tide, bucking Tammany Hall, bucking the political establishment. And Roosevelt caught note of these editorials. And one day he picked up this newfangled device called the telephone, and he called Joseph Bucklin Bishop and said, let's do lunch. And that's how the relationship began.
It's an interesting relationship because when people who know Roosevelt, they think of this larger-than-life, hard-charging, really dynamic figure. Joseph Bucklin Bishop was a little bit different.
He sure was. There probably were not two more unlikely characters in American history at that point. Roosevelt, you've described wonderfully. I call him in my book a 19th century action figure in spectacles. Bishop, by contrast, was bald. He was small. He was prim. He had this little shiny, little pointed beard. And he was very quiet. And he was sort of a little bit mousy, if you can understand that. And what held these two characters together was their common interest in good government and cleaning up bad government where it existed.
So despite their differences on the surface, they had a lot in common as to how they viewed the way the world should be and how the government should be run.
Exactly. And I think that's what attracted Roosevelt to Bishop more than anything else. He understood early on, among our very early presidents and political leaders, that journalists, opinionated journalists, could become tremendous allies of his political agenda. And that was really the dynamic duo that came out of this relationship of Roosevelt, the progressive Republican governor of New York, vice president, later president of the United States, who was out to reform the country internally and to flex American muscles externally. And Bishop agreed with a lot of that and supported him aggressively, even when many other newspapers and the editorialists of the day were not doing that, Bishop was constantly by his side. That relationship evolved into a friendship where they began to appreciate each other as people, and they began to meet for lunch, for breakfast, for dinners at the governor's mansion in New York with their wives, and later at the White House. And Bishop, in turn, became a valued political advisor to Roosevelt.
Well, it's interesting that we know how much they have in common, but they didn't always agree on everything. A real point of difference they had was involving I believe it was a 1902 anthracite coal strike.
Correct.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine today that something like a coal strike would be a national emergency, but it was back then because that's how Americans heated their homes, by and large. The winter was coming. The miners were on strike in the Pennsylvania coal fields for higher wages, better working conditions. The owners of the coal mines, who were also the railroad barons, one and the same, had locked out the strikers. And the result was that there was violence in the coal fields of Pennsylvania. Roosevelt felt very strongly that the workers, the miners, were correct, that they were not being treated well, they were not being paid fairly. Bishop, although favoring the coal mine owners, did so because he felt Roosevelt was inciting violence, because he felt if the miners got control of the situation and the mines out there, there would be murder, there would be violence, there would be mayhem. So he encouraged Roosevelt very strongly not to reflexively go with the miners, but to work with the mine owners as well. And Roosevelt took that advice, and he became a mediator in that coal strike to the point where he settled it, and he got the two sides to a table and to agree that they would come to a grand compromise. Prior to that time, presidents of the United States didn't do that sort of thing. They didn't insert themselves into labor management issues. But Roosevelt felt the issue was critical enough to the future of the country and the adequate supply of coal for the coming winter that it required his personal intervention. And he took some of Bishop's advice and solved it.
And Roosevelt's faith in Bishop extended to the point where he actually more or less put him in charge of the Panama Canal project, which I thought was rather interesting.
He really did. Bishop was sort of tired of being in New York at this point in the mid-1910s. Roosevelt had been elected to his first real term on his own, and Bishop asked Roosevelt if he could come to Washington to work side by side with him. Roosevelt agreed with that. He brought him to Washington, made him secretary of the Panama Canal Commission, which today we would call administrator, and eventually dispatched Bishop actually to the Isthmus of Panama to become the day-to-day overseer of the project there. It was the largest public works project ever undertaken at that point, bigger than the Suez Canal, bigger than anything had ever been done. And Roosevelt wanted this done right. He wanted money expended fairly and correctly. He did not want corruption. He wanted it done right. And he sent Bishop there to be his eyes and ears. And while Bishop was on the ground between 1905 and 1917, he wrote Roosevelt dozens and dozens of handwritten letters in which he told him the true skinny, as he said, as to what was going on there. He bypassed the State Department. He bypassed the War Department, all the official channels that one might have to go through in order to get the truth to the president directly. And that helped Roosevelt immeasurably in getting Congress to continue and complete the funding for the canal.
You also wrote something about Roosevelt and Bishop. You said, quote, "At the outset, they were great pals and loyal allies in the crusade against political corruption at the dawn of the progressive era. With quiet encouragement and support of newspaper editorials, my Uncle Joe helped T.R. achieve his reformist goals." That kind of close relationship between somebody in media and somebody in politics is somewhat frowned upon today. What was your reaction back then?
Yeah, it would be today, I think, because we like to see that wall of separation, generally speaking, between political figures and journalists. The difference was, I think, it was that Bishop was paid to have opinions. He was not paid to be objective. He was paid by his newspaper to take stands, to have opinions, to point thumbs up or thumbs down as he saw the situation. He was a little concerned about the closeness of that relationship, so he kept much of it quiet. And it was pretty much an underground friendship and a quiet friendship. But eventually word got out and people began to understand the importance that each man had with the other. I think the real significance of what Bishop did with Roosevelt with respect to journalists is that he helped to convince Roosevelt to throw open the gates of the White House to the news media. Prior to this time, journalists covering the White House were required to stand outside the gates and receive press releases that they were handed through the gates. And Bishop and Roosevelt thought that was not the most productive strategy to get the media on your side. So he encouraged Roosevelt to invite the journalists into the White House, and they created the White House press room, which did not exist prior to that time. And from that point forward, the press was allowed into the White House to closely cover what was going on there.
Do you see any kind of a similar relationship between a politician and a media figure like that in today's modern age?
Well, I think today some of our media, particularly the cable TV shows, have become overtly partisan. I mean, you know where one particular channel stands, one particular network stands versus another. So I think what is happening today is that some of the cable channels are overt allies of Republicans, and some tend to be a little more balanced. What bothers me about that is that some of these cable channels, and I think some of the talk radio as well, don't make any effort to hide this relationship. You know, it's right out there, and they're advocating for it, especially at times when they are pretending to be objective and pretending to give citizens news when it is in fact opinion. So I think you have a similar situation as you had 100 years ago, but it's much more overt and much more partisan than it was then.
Do you think it's more blatant than it was in Bishop's time and TR's time?
Absolutely. It was. I don't want to say covert, but it was discreet in those days. If you had a partner with someone in the world of journalism, you tried to keep that relationship under the table. Roosevelt would often feed Bishop inside information, which Bishop would use to write supportive editorials. Now, this goes on today, too. We call it leaking today. But it's much more systematic today than it was back then.
It was kind of more an informal sort of relation.
Yeah, very casual.
I wanted to ask, what made you decide to write this book in the first place?
Well, the story really goes back to when I was a young fellow, maybe around 12 years old. I can recall sitting around my dining table with my extended family at holidays, and invariably talk would turn to Theodore Roosevelt and his buddy, Uncle Joe Bishop. And I would hear stories about this relationship. Well, that sort of sank in. And later, as I got older and went off to college, I had an uncle, a different uncle, who would give me as Christmas presents copies of Joseph Bucklin Bishop's books. And there were 20 of them in his lifetime. And, you know, I was busy in school and raising a family and getting married and starting a career. So all of those books sort of went onto the bookshelf until about 3 or 4 years ago when I was sitting in my den one night looking at these books. And I said to myself, this is a story that has never been told, and it really needs to be told. So I set out to tell it. And the gold mine for me was the fact that Roosevelt and Bishop had written 600 letters to each other over the course of their 25-year friendship. And those letters are publicly available. I went to Harvard University, where they're on microfilm, and I copied all the letters onto CD and took them home and began reading those letters. And the story unfolded directly from these letters.
And I can't help but notice that you followed a career path that was somewhat similar to your uncle's. You were a journalist at one time. You became involved in politics, so you advised a president yourself. And now, of course, you're still involved in the community scene. You're on the board of trustees of the Mashpee Public Library. Did your uncle inspire you to pursue this course?
I can't say that it was inspirational, but I can say that in writing the book and researching the book, I had a certain comfort level. I had a certain familiarity with politics and with journalism, political campaigns, that helped me fulfill the axiom that every writer is told, write what you know. And this is what I knew, this is what I've lived and what I've experienced. So it was relatively easy from that standpoint.
In the course of researching this book, what did you learn about Teddy Roosevelt that surprised you the most, and what did you learn about your uncle that surprised you the most?
I had heard and I had read in other Roosevelt books and biographies that the relationship was sort of one-sided, that Bishop was called a sycophant, meaning that he was a sort of a leeching character who would always want to be with the famous and the powerful. That was where I started with that assumption. And I was challenged by the great Roosevelt biographer Edmund Morris to disprove that theory, because he believed that. And I said to him, I am going to disprove that. And what I found in the letters, researching and telling the story, was that yes, Bishop was very dependent on Roosevelt, but equally so, Roosevelt was dependent on Bishop, especially as that relationship grew and matured. Roosevelt was constantly, continually writing his friend or calling him and summoning him from New York to come to Washington for consultations and for advice. Roosevelt rarely made a political decision without first talking to Bishop. And it surprised me that this Rooseveltian figure that you described at the start of the program would be as dependent on somebody as he really turned out to be. And that made me like Theodore Roosevelt even more, to be honest with you. I understand the macho-ness and I understand the Rough Rider and all of that, but there was a side of Roosevelt that allowed him to have an open mind and to assert and collect other opinions.
Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today and discussing this very fascinating book and story, so thank you so much. My guest today was writer Chip Bishop. To learn more about Mr. Bishop and his book, The Lion and the Journalist, The Unlikely Friendship of Theodore Roosevelt and Joseph Bucklin Bishop, go to chipbishop.com. I'm Dan McCready, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.